I'm Valentina, 28 female. I live in a modest one-bedroom apartment in a city where that's considered a luxury, and I work as an HR coordinator, a job that's all about process, fairness, and ensuring people are treated equitably. My life is a carefully constructed set of spreadsheets and balanced budgets, a quiet rebellion against the chaotic emotional and financial landscape of the family I grew up in. For years, I thought my diligence was a virtue. It turns out, my family just saw it as a resource to be exploited. This is the story of how one Christmas, a brand new car, and a petty bill for a family data plan finally broke a lifetime of conditioning. It's about how I took the money meant to be another link in my chain and used it to buy a plane ticket, severing the financial cord to my family forever. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Growing up, our family had an unwritten, unspoken rule. There were two standards, one for my younger sister, Isabella, and one for me. I was the responsible one, a title that sounded like a compliment but was, in reality, a life sentence of expectations. Valentina will figure it out. Valentina will handle it. Valentina is so mature for her age. These were the phrases that formed the soundtrack of my childhood. They were the justifications for why I had to start an after-school job at 16 to save for a used car, while Isabella, at the same age, had one leased for her as a surprise birthday gift because she was focusing on her creative pursuits. My father, Richard, is a financial advisor. He spends his days managing multi-million-dollar portfolios for his clients, preaching the gospel of fiscal responsibility and savvy investments. At home, however, his expertise was selectively applied. For me, he was a hawk, scrutinizing every one of my student loan applications and lecturing me on the importance of compound interest when I wanted to buy a new laptop for college. I had to present a detailed budget and a repayment plan, which, in hindsight, was a valuable lesson. But it was a lesson never taught to Isabella. For her, my father's wallet was an open door. Her art supplies, her weekend trips with friends, her ever-expanding wardrobe, they were all just line items in the family budget, unquestioned and approved without a second thought. My mother, Eleanor, was the architect of this dynamic. She had been a bank teller before she married my father and dedicated her life to being a homemaker. She managed the household with an iron will, and her primary project was curating Isabella's life. Isabella was her masterpiece, the beautiful, charming, and free-spirited daughter who would live the life Eleanor never could. I was the nuts and bolts daughter, the one who was practical and reliable, like a sturdy appliance. Useful, necessary, but never admired. This was never more apparent than during family gatherings. Isabella's latest social triumph or a new dress would be the centerpiece of conversation, while my promotion at work would receive a polite nod before the topic inevitably shifted back to Isabella's upcoming weekend getaway. I remember one specific incident when I was 19, home from college for the summer. I'd worked 2 jobs to save up enough money for a down payment on a newer, more reliable used car, as my old one was on its last legs. I found a perfect 5-year-old sedan, and I was ecstatic. When I proudly showed it to my parents, my father's first comment was, "Did you get a good interest rate on the loan, Valentina?" My mother just said, "Oh, that's sensible." Gray is a very practical color. 2 weeks later, Isabella, then 16, scuffed the bumper of her leased SUV. My father didn't lecture her, he just took it to the dealership to be fixed, no questions asked. My mother comforted her, saying, "Don't worry, sweetie, that's what insurance is for." The car was just a thing. Isabella's feelings were what mattered. My accomplishment was a transaction. Her mistake was an emotional event requiring support. This pattern continued into our adult lives. I graduated from college with a practical degree and a mountain of student debt that I began methodically chipping away at. I got my job in HR, found my own apartment, and built my life from the ground up. Every piece of furniture, every vacation, every emergency fund contribution was a product of my own hard work. Isabella, on the other hand, pursued a degree in communications with a minor in art history. Upon graduation, she decided she wanted to be an event planner for a luxury brand, a competitive field with notoriously low starting salaries. My parents, of course, supported her dream. They paid for her stylish apartment in a trendy part of the city, an expense they justified by saying she needed to live in an area conned. Conducive to her career. Her car, her groceries, her endless stream of new outfits, all were subsidized by the bank of mom and dad. I tried to talk to them about it once, a few years ago. I approached it gently, framing it as a concern for Isabella's future. "Don't you think it would be good for her to learn how to budget?" I asked my mother over the phone. "She needs to be able to stand on her own 2 feet eventually." The line went cold. "Valentina, you don't understand the pressure she's under," Eleanor said, her voice laced with disappointment. "Her industry is all about appearances. We're just helping her get started." "You were always different. You never needed that kind of help." It was a master class in gaslighting. My independence wasn't a strength to be celebrated. It was a trait that made me ineligible for the support and softness they lavished on my sister. I wasn't the one who didn't need help. I was the one who was never offered it. My best friend, Sophia, was my lifeline. A brilliant software engineer who had pulled herself up from a genuinely tough background, she saw the dynamic in my family with a clarity I often lacked. "They're not just supporting her, Val," she told me one evening over dinner. "They're enabling her, and they're using your competence as an excuse to do it. It's like you're the family's designated adult, and everyone else gets to be a kid." She was right, of course. My responsibility wasn't just my own, it was a family utility. It was the bedrock that allowed the others the freedom to be irresponsible. It was the stable ground from which Isabella could launch her endlessly fascinating, endlessly funded life. Every time I paid my bills on time, every time I put money into my retirement account, I was reinforcing their narrative. Valentina has it covered. This made it easy for them to overlook me, to take my stability for granted, and to pour all their resources, financial and emotional, into the squeaky wheel. The tradition of imbalance wasn't just a habit, it was the fundamental operating system of our family. And as Christmas approached, that system was about to execute a program so insulting, so brazen, that it would finally force me to shut it all down. Christmas at our family home was always an elaborate affair, orchestrated by my mother with the precision of a theater director. The house would be decorated to within an inch of its life. The scent of pine and baked goods would hang heavy in the air, and the tree would be buried under a mountain of presents. But like everything else in our family, the gift-giving was a performance with a hidden script. It was a physical manifestation of the family hierarchy, a display of affection and value that was anything but equal. For years, I had learned to manage my expectations. I would receive practical, thoughtful in a boring way gifts, a new set of pots and pans, a gift certificate to a sensible clothing store, a high-quality vacuum cleaner. They were gifts for an adult, for a homeowner, for the responsible one. They were acknowledgments of my station in life, not celebrations of me as a person. Isabella, on the other hand, received magic. Her gifts were the stuff of dreams: designer handbags, tickets to music festivals, a new laptop simply because her old one was the wrong color. Her presents were about desire, not need. They were about fueling her whims and padding her already comfortable life with even more luxury. I'd grown accustomed to the disparity. I would smile, say thank you for my new air fryer, and watch as Isabella unwrapped a beautiful leather jacket she'd mentioned wanting once, months ago. I'd learned to swallow the lump in my throat and tell myself that this was just how it was. I was the practical daughter. She was the pampered one. The roles had been cast long ago. This year, however, felt different from the start. A few weeks before Christmas, my mother had been dropping hints about a very big surprise for Isabella. "She's been working so hard," Eleanor would say over the phone. "We just want to give her a little boost." I knew what working hard meant. It meant that Isabella had successfully planned a small launch party for a new perfume, a job for which she was, of course, paid. The boost was my parents' way of rewarding her for simply doing her job. I gritted my teeth and said nothing. I was busy closing out the year at my own job, a genuinely stressful period of processing end-of-year bonuses, managing holiday leave requests, and preparing for the new fiscal year. My hard work didn't warrant a boost. It was just expected. On Christmas morning, the air in the living room was thick with anticipation. My father had a smug, self-satisfied look on his face, the one he got when he was about to unveil something he considered a masterstroke of generosity. We went through the usual routine of opening smaller gifts first. I received a very nice, very sensible wool coat from my parents. It was practical. It would keep me warm. I thanked them sincerely. Isabella received a series of smaller, expensive-looking boxes containing jewelry, high-end makeup, and a gift card for a spa day. Then came the main event. My father stood up and announced, "Okay, Isabella, your big gift is outside." Isabella feigned surprise, though she clearly knew something was coming. We all followed her to the front door. There in the driveway sat a brand-new pearl-white compact SUV, a massive red bow stuck to the windshield. Isabella shrieked with a delight that sounded almost rehearsed. She ran to the car, hugging the hood as if it were a long-lost pet. "Oh my God, you guys, you did!" she squealed, tears of joy streaming down her face. My mother beamed, wrapping an arm around my father. "You deserve it, sweetie," Richard said, puffing out his chest. "Your mother and I are so proud of you." Proud of what, I wondered. Proud of her for existing, for being the daughter who required constant, expensive affirmations of her worth. I stood on the porch, a cold wind whipping around me, and I felt a familiar numbness settle in. The wool coat on my shoulders suddenly felt heavy and suffocating. It was a nice coat, but it wasn't a car. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a utility, just like me. I plastered a smile on my face and said, "Congratulations, Izzy, it's beautiful." She barely heard me, already inside the car, running her hands over the leather steering wheel. We all went back inside, the rest of the day now destined to revolve around Isabella's new car. She would talk about where she would drive it first, how all her friends would be so jealous, how perfect the color was. My parents would hang on her every word, their faces glowing with vicarious joy. Later that evening, after the festive dinner had been eaten and the excitement had started to wane, my father approached me. The smug look was gone, replaced by something more businesslike. "Valentina, I have something for you as well," he said, holding out a crisp white envelope. For a fleeting, foolish moment, a spark of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe there was something else. Maybe they realized how skewed the morning had been. Maybe this was a check, a gesture to even the scales just a little. I took the envelope. It felt thin, too thin to be a card full of cash. It just had my name, Valentina, written on the front in my mother's neat cursive. I opened it. Inside wasn't a check or a Christmas card. It was a bill. An invoice, to be precise, printed from my father's home office computer. It was a detailed breakdown of my portion of the family mobile data plan for the entire past year. The total at the bottom was circled in red ink, $784.56. At the very bottom, my father had typed a little note. "Please remit payment by January 15th. Love, Mom and Dad. Love." I stared at the piece of paper, my mind struggling to process the sheer, calculated pettiness of it. On the same day they had gifted my sister a vehicle worth at least $30,000. They were presenting me with an itemized bill for my share of a family utility we had all been on for years. I had always assumed it was something my father, with his comfortable income, just covered. I had never been asked to pay for it before. Why now? Why on Christmas Day, just hours after the grand car reveal? It was an insult so profound, so deeply dismissive of my worth that it transcended mere thoughtlessness. It was a statement. It was a message. My sister, the golden child, deserved gifts of immense value, free and clear. I, the responsible one, deserved a bill, an obligation, a reminder of my place. The numbness I had felt earlier was replaced by a cold, sharp anger that was utterly clarifying. The tradition of imbalance had been upheld, but this time, the insult was so loud it had deafened me to any lingering sense of familial duty. This time, they had finally gone too far. I held the invoice in my hand, the paper feeling flimsy and absurdly light, a stark contrast to the crushing weight it placed on my spirit. The living room was still filled with the remnants of Christmas cheer, wrapping paper, empty glasses, the faint scent of cinnamon. But it all felt like a movie set where the actors had suddenly dropped character. My parents and Isabella were cooing over the car's brochure, discussing optional extras like heated seats and a sunroof. Their cheerful chatter was a distant, buzzing noise, like a radio playing in another room. My entire world had narrowed to the piece of paper in my hand, to the black ink and the neatly aligned columns that spelled out my family's true feelings for me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My father looked up from the brochure, his expression one of mild impatience, as if I were a client questioning a standard fee. "It's your share of the phone plan, Valentina," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "We've been carrying you on it for years, and now that you're well-established, a leaner, and I thought it was time you started covering your own portion. It's about financial responsibility." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Financial responsibility. He said the words without a trace of irony, just hours after dropping a fortune on a depreciating asset for my sister, who had never been asked to be financially responsible for anything in her life. "You're giving me a bill for Christmas?" I pressed, the anger in my chest beginning to burn hotter. My mother finally looked over, her face a mask of carefully constructed innocence. "Oh, honey, don't think of it as a bill," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Think of it as a contribution. We're all a family and we all chip in." This was her specialty, reframing cruelty as a virtue. It wasn't a bill, it was a contribution. It wasn't a slight, it was a lesson. It wasn't them devaluing me, it was me finally stepping up. Isabella glanced over, a flicker of something, was it pity, or worse, amusement, in her eyes before she quickly looked back at the brochure. She was a passive participant, but her silence was a form of consent. She knew the game. She had always benefited from its rules. I looked back down at the invoice. $784.56. It wasn't an astronomical sum. I could afford to pay it. My careful budgeting and steady job meant I had savings. I could write a check and this whole ugly moment would, on the surface, disappear. But it was never about the money. It was about the message. The car was a gift of love. The bill was a transaction. Isabella was an investment in joy. I was an expense to be managed. The very act of them printing it out, of my father sitting at his computer and itemizing my data usage, of my mother writing my name on the envelope, it was all so deliberate. This wasn't a thoughtless oversight. It was a calculated action, designed to reinforce my place in the family's pecking order. They had waited until I was feeling the sting of the disparity from the car, and then they had twisted the knife. "Why now?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "We've been on this plan for almost a decade. Why is it an issue on this specific Christmas day?" My father sighed, putting on his patient financial advisor persona. "There's no good time for these things, Valentina. It's the end of the fiscal year and I was reviewing our expenses. It just made sense to address it now. Don't be so dramatic." Dramatic. The ultimate dismissal. My valid feelings, my righteous anger, were being written off as female hysteria. He wasn't just presenting a bill, he was critiquing my reaction to it. He was managing my emotions just as he managed his accounts. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a fight-or-flight response kicking in. For my entire life, my response had been flight. I would retreat, swallow my hurt, and maintain the peace. But as I looked at their three faces, my father's condescending calm, my mother's feigned concern, my sister's deliberate ignorance, I knew that fleeing was no longer an option. I had to fight. I folded the piece of paper neatly and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't say another word. I didn't yell or cry. I simply stood up. "Thank you for the coat," I said, my voice devoid of all warmth. "It was a lovely evening, but I should get going. I have an early start tomorrow." My mother started to protest. "But honey, it's Christmas night. Don't you want to stay and watch a movie with us?" The offer was so grotesquely normal, so disconnected from the reality of what had just happened, that I almost laughed. They wanted to hand me an itemized betrayal and then settle in for a cozy holiday film. They wanted me to absorb the blow and then pretend it never happened, to smooth over the conflict as I always had. But the person who used to do that was gone. She had evaporated the moment I read the words, "Please remit payment." As I drove home, the sensible wool coat in the passenger seat beside me, the anger began to morph into a cold, hard clarity. The bill wasn't just an insult, it was evidence. It was a contract, written by my parents, outlining the terms of my value to them. It was proof that my contributions to the family, the emotional support, the reliability, the lack of drama, the very fact that I never asked for anything, were not only unappreciated but invisible. They didn't see my independence as a success, they saw it as a reason to charge me for services rendered. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself, but in the meticulous, documented nature of it. It was itemized. Line by line, month by month, they had calculated my cost, and in doing so, they had shown me exactly what I was worth. As I pulled into my own apartment complex, the one I paid for myself, I took the invoice out of my pocket. I wasn't going to pay it. Not a single cent. This piece of paper wasn't an obligation. It was a release. It was the starting pistol for a race I didn't even know I needed to run, a race toward a finish line they couldn't even see. They thought they were closing an account. They had no idea they had just opened my eyes. The days following Christmas were a blur of quiet, simmering rage. I went back to work and moved through my daily tasks like an automaton. I processed payroll changes, answered emails about benefits packages, and mediated a minor dispute between two employees in the marketing department. It was all about fairness and procedure, a world away from the arbitrary and emotional rules of my family. Each evening, I would come home to my quiet apartment, and the invoice would be sitting on my kitchen counter where I'd left it. It was a constant, mocking presence. $784.56, a number that had become symbolic of so much more. My father's deadline of January 15th loomed, not as a threat, but as a timeline. A deadline for my decision. My first instinct was simply to ignore them, to let the date pass and see what happened. But my friend Sophia, ever the pragmatist, advised against it. "Don't just go silent, Val," she said over a video call, her face etched with concern. "That lets them control the narrative. They'll paint you as petulant and ungrateful. You need a plan, you need data." As a software engineer, Sophia thought in terms of data. For her, every problem could be broken down into its component parts, analyzed, and solved with logic. "He's a financial advisor, right?" she continued. "He thinks in numbers, so you need to fight him with numbers. You need to understand the full scope of their financial support system." Her words struck a chord. My father had presented me with an itemized bill. It was time for me to conduct my own audit. For my entire adult life, I had deliberately kept my finances separate and avoided asking questions about theirs. It was my way of maintaining independence. But now, I realized that my ignorance had been a liability. It had allowed them to create and maintain the narrative that I was the financially secure one who needed nothing, while Isabella was the struggling artist who needed everything. It was time to find out just how wide that gap truly was. My investigation started with a trip down memory lane, armed with a laptop and a fresh spreadsheet. I began to list every major expense I could remember for both myself and Isabella, starting from when we turned 16. My first car, a $4,000 used sedan, paid for with my own money from a part-time job. Her first car, a leased SUV, payments covered by our parents, which I estimated at around $400 a month for 3 years, totaling over $14,000. And that was just the first one. She had another leased vehicle after that before this new, gifted one. College was the next big category. I had gone to a state school, worked through all 4 years, and took out significant student loans to cover the rest. I was still paying them off. My parents had contributed a modest, lump sum amount to my tuition fund when I started, something around $10,000. Isabella had gone to a private arts college with a much higher tuition. I knew for a fact they had paid for her housing and a significant portion of her tuition because my mother had often lamented how expensive it was, always in a way that framed it as a noble sacrifice for their daughter's dream. The real discovery, however, came from a moment of digital forensics. I remembered that years ago, my father had set up a shared family cloud account to store photos. In a moment of inspiration, I logged in, wondering if there was anything else stored there. Tucked away in a folder labeled Household Admin, I found a treasure trove. It seemed my father, in his meticulous way, had saved old financial documents. Among them were old bank statements and spreadsheets from years ago. He had password-protected the most recent files, but he'd been careless with the older ones. I found a budget spreadsheet from the year Isabella graduated college. It was all there, in black and white. Isabella apartment rent, $2,200 month. Isabella car payment and insurance, $650 month. Isabella general support, $1,000 month. My hands were shaking as I did the math. They were spending nearly $4,000 a month to subsidize her life. That was almost $50,000 a year, and this spreadsheet was from 3 years ago. It had likely only increased since then. I scrolled through the document, my heart pounding. I saw payments for her credit card bills, transfers for vacation funds, even a line item for her gym membership. Then, I saw my own name. Valentina phone plan, $65.38. That was it. That was my only entry on the entire support ledger. In a family budget that was hemorrhaging tens of thousands of dollars a year to prop up my sister's lifestyle, my only financial connection was a $65 phone bill. The anger I felt on Christmas Day was nothing compared to the cold, hard fury that settled over me now. It wasn't just about the car. It wasn't just about the bill. It was about a systematic, long-term, and grossly imbalanced distribution of family resources. I had been subsidizing my sister's life, not directly, but indirectly. My financial independence, my refusal to ask for help, my entire responsible existence had created the financial surplus that made Isabella's pampered life possible. They weren't just helping her, they were bankrolling a complete fabrication of a successful, independent young woman. I had been working my tail off, saving every penny, making responsible choices, and all that hard work had done was make it easier for my parents to throw money at my sister's every whim. I started a new tab on my spreadsheet, titling it The Real Balance Sheet. On one side, I listed all the financial support Isabella had received since she was 16. I used conservative estimates, but even so, the number quickly climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. On the other side, I listed the support I had received, the one-time $10,000 for college. The disparity was staggering. It was an indictment. This document, this spreadsheet I was creating, was my counter-invoice. My father wanted to talk about numbers. Fine, we would talk about numbers. I now had the data Sophia told me I needed. The money trail didn't just show a preference. It showed a deliberate, sustained, and wildly unfair financial strategy that had shaped our entire lives. My path forward was becoming clearer with every cell I filled. This wasn't just about refusing to pay a bill anymore. This was about severing a connection that was not just emotionally, but financially toxic. Armed with my spreadsheet, which I had appropriately named the family audit, I felt a profound shift inside me. The hurt and confusion had crystallized into a single, unshakable purpose. The question was no longer if I should confront them, but how. A simple, angry phone call wouldn't suffice. Yelling would only allow them to dismiss me as dramatic again. I needed an action, a clear, decisive, and irreversible move that would speak louder than any words I could ever say. I needed to demonstrate my independence in a way they couldn't ignore or reframe. The idea came to me late one night as I was scrolling through travel websites, a form of escapism I often indulged in. I had always dreamed of visiting Italy. I wanted to see the Colosseum, wander through the streets of Florence, and eat pasta in a tiny, family-owned trattoria. It was a distant, someday dream, something I had filed away in the responsible future folder of my mind. But as I stared at the pictures of sun-drenched Tuscan hills, a new thought sparked. What if someday was now? I looked at the invoice on my counter. $784.56. Then I looked at my savings account, the money I had so carefully accumulated for a down payment on a house or some other sensible, adult milestone. What if I took the bill money and a portion of my responsible savings and bought a plane ticket, not as an act of impulsive rebellion, but as a strategic investment in myself? It would be the ultimate statement. They had handed me a bill, a symbol of my financial obligation to them. I would respond by taking that exact amount and using it as the seed money for an act of total, glorious independence. The symbolism was perfect. I wouldn't just be refusing to pay, I would be transforming their petty insult into the foundation of my freedom. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a declaration of intent. It was my independence itinerary. The plan began to take shape with a feverish intensity. I spent the next week in a whirlwind of secret planning. During my lunch breaks, I researched flights to Rome. In the evenings, I scoured blogs for tips on solo travel and booked charming, affordable guest houses. I created a new spreadsheet, this one filled with train schedules, museum opening times, and restaurant recommendations. Every booking I made, every confirmation email that landed in my inbox felt like a small victory, a brick being laid in the foundation of my new life. I requested 2 weeks of vacation from work, my heart pounding as I clicked submit on the HR portal. It was approved within the hour. It was real. Sophia was my co-conspirator and cheerleader. When I told her my plan, she let out a whoop of joy. Yes, Valentina, this is perfect. It's not petty revenge, it's poetic justice. You're literally converting their toxicity into an adventure. She helped me think through the logistics. You can't just disappear, she advised. You need to handle the exit strategy. The phone plan, any other lingering ties, you need to make a clean break. She was right. This had to be a complete severance. The first step was untangling myself from the family data plan. I went to a mobile carrier store and set up a new plan under my own name. It was a simple, administrative task, but it felt momentous. The clerk asked if I wanted to port my old number over. I paused for a moment, then said, yes. I was keeping my number. I wasn't changing my identity. I was just changing who paid the bills. I walked out of the store with a new SIM card in my hand, a tiny piece of plastic that represented a massive shift in my life. I would activate it on the day I left. Next, I went through every aspect of my life to ensure there were no other hidden financial or administrative ties to my parents. My bank accounts were solely in my name. My car, which I had bought and paid for myself, was in my name. My apartment lease was in my name. My student loans were my own. My entire life, built on a foundation of forced independence, was already primed for this moment. Their one remaining point of leverage was the phone plan, and I was about to neutralize it. The irony was bitter, but also empowering. The very responsibility they had used as an excuse to neglect me had become my greatest weapon. I didn't need their help, and because of that, they had no power over me. The final piece of the plan was the confrontation itself. I decided it had to be in person, and it had to be on my terms. My father's deadline was January 15th. I booked my flight to Rome for January 16th. I would visit my parents on the 15th, the day the bill was due. I wouldn't go to argue or to plead my case. I would go to deliver a statement. I rehearsed what I would say, not to memorize a script, but to fortify my resolve. I would be calm, direct, and unwavering. I would present the facts as I had uncovered them, not as accusations, but as simple, undeniable truths. As the departure date grew closer, a sense of calm settled over me. This was no longer just a reaction to a single insult. It was the culmination of a lifetime of slights, a conscious decision to stop accepting a role I had never auditioned for. The trip to Italy was no longer just a vacation. It was a pilgrimage. I wasn't running away from my family, I was walking toward myself. The itinerary in my folder wasn't just a list of places to see, it was a step-by-step guide to my own liberation. They wanted me to pay a bill. Instead, I was about to close the account for good. January 15th arrived, a cold and gray Tuesday. The invoice had sat on my counter for 3 weeks, a silent witness to my transformation. As I got ready to drive to my parents' house that evening, I felt surprisingly serene. The anxiety and anger had been replaced by a resolute sense of purpose. I dressed in simple, professional attire, dark trousers, and a blazer. I wanted to look like the composed, independent adult they had always claimed I was. This was a business meeting, in a way. It was the dissolution of a long-standing, unwritten, and deeply unfair contract. I had my family audit spreadsheet saved on my phone, but I knew I wouldn't need it. The numbers were seared into my memory. More importantly, I had the confirmation email for my flight to Rome and the receipt for my new independent phone plan. These were my closing documents. I placed the original invoice my father had given me into an envelope. Inside, I also enclosed a short, formal letter I had typed up. It was my official notice of financial separation. When I arrived, the scene was one of domestic tranquility. My father was reading the newspaper in his armchair, my mother was in the kitchen humming to herself, and Isabella was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, probably admiring photos of her new car. It was as if the tension of Christmas night had never happened. This was their superpower, the ability to ignore any unpleasantness, to rewrite history in real time. They greeted me with a casual warmth that was more chilling than any overt hostility. "Valentina, honey, what a nice surprise," my mother said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Here to drop off your payment for the phone bill?" my father asked without looking up from his paper, his tone matter of fact. He assumed I had come to capitulate. He assumed I had come to be the responsible one, as always. "I'm here to discuss that, yes," I said, my voice steady. I walked into the center of the room, forcing them all to look at me. Isabella glanced up, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "I won't be paying the bill," I stated simply. My father finally lowered his newspaper, a frown creasing his forehead. "Excuse me, it's past due, Valentina." "Actually," I corrected him, "the note said payment was due by January 15th, today, but that's irrelevant because I'm not paying it. I am, however, closing the account." I placed the envelope on the coffee table in front of him. Inside is the original invoice. As of this morning, I have ported my number to a new carrier. I am no longer on the family plan. You can remove my line effective immediately. A stunned silence filled the room. This was not how the script was supposed to go. I was supposed to grumble, maybe argue a little, but ultimately write the check. My father was the first to recover. "Don't be ridiculous, Valentina. This is about principle. It's a shared expense." "Then let's talk ob." "Out shared expenses," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "For the past 3 years, you have spent approximately $50,000 per year supporting Isabella. That includes her rent, her car, her insurance, and a general stipend. By my conservative estimate, since she turned 16, you have provided her with well over $200,000 in financial support. In that same time, you have given me $10,000 for my education. I have paid for everything else myself." My father's face turned a blotchy red. My mother looked horrified, not at the facts, but at the fact that I was saying them out loud. That's a private family matter," Eleanor stammered. "It's a financial matter," I countered, looking directly at my father. "And you, of all people, should understand the numbers. I am not angry that you chose to support Isabella. That is your prerogative. But I will no longer accept being treated as a debtor in a household where I am the only one expected to be fully financially independent. You don't get to subsidize her dreams and then bill me for my data usage. The hypocrisy is astounding." Isabella finally spoke, her voice dripping with indignation. "This is so unfair, Valentina. You're just jealous. You've always been jealous of me." "No, Izzy," I said, turning to her, my voice softening slightly but losing none of its firmness. "I'm not jealous of you. I'm proud of the life I've built for myself, but I'm done pretending that our circumstances are equal. Your lifestyle has been funded by a bank that I was never allowed to borrow from. That's a fact, not an accusation." I turned back to my parents. "This isn't a negotiation. This is a notification. My financial life is now completely separate from yours. The phone plan was the last tie, and it has been cut." My mother began to cry softly. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're a family." "This isn't what a healthy family does," I said gently. "A healthy family doesn't gift one child a car and the other an invoice. A healthy family doesn't create a system of such profound imbalance and then pretend it doesn't exist." I took a deep breath. It was time for the final act. "I have one more thing to tell you. I've decided to use the money, the $784.56 you asked me for, as the first installment on a trip for myself. I'm going to Italy. My flight leaves tomorrow morning. The room fell utterly silent. The shock on their faces was palpable. Italy, a trip. It was something they would have funded for Isabella without a second thought. But for me, it was an act of defiance. They stared at me as if I had announced I was moving to the moon. They couldn't process it. The responsible one, the practical one, was doing something for herself, something indulgent, something joyful. I looked at each of them one last time, my father speechless with rage, my mother lost in a sea of confused tears, and Isabella, whose face was a mixture of shock and for the first time a glimmer of understanding. Perhaps she was finally realizing that the bank was about to close. "I hope you all have a good year," I said, my voice clear and final. "I'll be in touch when I get back." And with that, I turned and walked out the door. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. The final transaction was complete. I had bought my freedom. The flight to Rome felt like a passage into another dimension. As the plane ascended, leaving the familiar grid of city lights behind, I felt the weight of my 28 years of familial obligation lifting off my shoulders. I deactivated my old SIM card and put in the new one. The simple act of doing so felt like a final, definitive click. A new connection, on my terms. For the next 2 weeks, I was not Valentina, the responsible daughter, or Valentina, the HR coordinator. I was just Valentina, a traveler, an explorer, a free woman. Italy was everything I had dreamed of and more. It was a sensory overload in the best possible way. I stood in awe in the middle of the Roman Forum, tracing the steps of people who lived thousands of years ago. I ate gelato by the Trevi Fountain and didn't think once about the cost. I took a train to Florence, where I spent an entire day in the Uffizi Gallery, getting lost in the beauty of Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci. I wandered through winding cobblestone streets with no agenda, discovering hidden courtyards and tiny cafes. For the first time in my adult life, my time was completely my own. My decisions were not dictated by budgets, expectations, or the needs of others. I spoke to my friend Sophia every few days, sending her pictures of pasta, ancient ruins, and stunning landscapes. "You sound different," she said during one call. "Lighter." She was right. I felt lighter. I realized how much mental and emotional energy I had been dedicating to managing my family's dynamics, to bracing myself for the next subtle slight, the next unfair comparison. With that burden gone, I so much more space in my mind. Space to think, to dream, to simply be. When I returned home, tanned and tired and deeply happy, I felt like a different person. My small apartment, which had sometimes felt like a lonely fortress, now felt like a sanctuary. It was my space, earned and paid for by me. My peace was no longer contingent on anyone else's approval. A few days after I got back, a letter arrived. It was from my mother. It was a long, rambling, guilt-laden missive about how I had broken her heart, how I had been cruel and selfish, how family is supposed to stick together no matter what. It was filled with phrases like, "After all we've done for you," and "You've thrown it all back in our faces." Notably, it contained no apology, no acknowledgement of my feelings, and no recognition of the facts I had presented. It was an attempt to pull me back into the old dynamic, to make me feel guilty enough to come crawling back and resume my role. I read it once, folded it, and put it in a drawer. It had no power over me anymore. The real test came about a month later. I received a text from Isabella. "Hey, Mom told me you were back. Can we talk?" I agreed to meet her for coffee, purely out of curiosity. She looked different. There were faint, dark circles under her eyes. She confessed that things had been difficult. With my financial secession, my father had apparently started scrutinizing the family finances more closely. He had told Isabella he was cutting her general support, stipend, and that she would have to start covering her own groceries and credit card bills. He and my mother had a massive fight about it. "He said we need to start being more responsible with our money," she said, the irony apparently lost on her. "He's making me create a budget. Can you believe it?" I just looked at her and nodded. "Yes, Izzy, I can believe it." For a moment, I thought she was going to ask me for money. Instead, she asked me for advice. How do you do it?" she asked, her voice small. "Budgeting and all that, I don't even know where to start." In that moment, I didn't feel anger or resentment. I felt a strange, detached kind of pity. She was like a bird who had been kept in a gilded cage her whole life and was suddenly being told to fly. She had no idea how. I spent 20 minutes explaining the basics of a simple budgeting app, how to track income and expenses, how to prioritize needs over wants. It was the most honest, practical conversation we had ever had. As we left, she said, "The house is so quiet now. Mom and Dad are tense all the time." The family's designated shock absorber was gone, and they were finally feeling the bumps in the road. I never did reconcile with my parents in the traditional sense. Our relationship now exists at a polite, carefully maintained distance. We exchange texts on birthdays and holidays. There are no more grand Christmas gatherings. There are no more assumptions or obligations. It's not the warm, loving family I once wished for, but it's something much healthier. It's honest. My father has never mentioned the bill again. He and my mother have to live with the new reality they created. They lost a daughter not because I left, but because they drove me away with 1,000 small cuts and one final, itemized insult. My life now operates on a new balance sheet. My assets are my independence, my peace of mind, and the freedom to invest in my own joy. My liabilities, the guilt, the resentment, the feeling of being perpetually undervalued, have been paid in full. My trip to Italy was just the beginning. I've since traveled to Spain and am planning a trip to Greece next year. My savings account is still growing, but now it's for my future, whatever I decide that may be. I learned that cutting a financial cord is about more than just money. It's about reclaiming your own value. My family put a price on my contribution to their lives. It turns out, my freedom was worth so much more.